Okay, so today we're going to start and finish. We're not going to spend a lot of time on him, Epictetus, and we're going to talk about a different ancient philosophy that has always had adherents in ancient times. Once the Hellenistic age started, and then it kind of went into decline, although it got absorbed by a lot of Christian thought. And then it had a resurgence in the modern period, went back into decline a bit, and then it's had a new resurgence again in our contemporary time, in your lifetime. Stoicism is starting to catch back on as a way of doing things. And I'm going to talk a little bit I'm going to tell you a little bit why that's the case and how that's turned out that way. But I want you to, as we do often, I want you to think about these questions and write down some responses to them that we're going to use as examples during this class. I want you to think about what has been, well, this shouldn't have been a minor, what has been a major disappointment in your life so far. You've all lived at least 18 years. Some things have not been good. You've had some setbacks, some griefs, some things that haven't gone the way that you wanted them to. Hopefully a lot more good things than bad things, but you've had some things that didn't go well. So I want you to think about, and you don't have to pick the worst one, but just think about something that really got to you. And then think about a recent minor annoyance, because I'm willing to bet that over break, there was at least one thing that ticked you off, irritated you, annoyed you. Everybody can think of something like that? Could have been just the train not running on time. Could have been having to take the midterm, anything like that, right? And then I want you to think about what is something that you have been very happy about or over. Something that has made your life much better. Could be something that you still experience now. Could be something that you just remember. Could be something that you did. Could be something that somebody did for you. Any of those sorts of things. And we're going to use those as examples and try to look at them the way that Epictetus would look at them and see whether it's rational to buy into them. So while you're doing that, what is the key question that Epictetus starts with? What is in our control? And he takes a position that's different than a lot of other people. As a matter of fact, he's taking a position that's different from, say, Aristotle or Plato, people that we've studied so far this semester. Not totally different. There are some ways in which they agree, but there's other ways in which they disagree. Why is he asking that question? Well, it all comes down to this issue of freedom or unfreedom. And that is the thing that the Stoics are really focused on. When we use this word stoic in our vocabulary, I think all of you have heard that term, right? Stoic. Somebody has a stoic demeanor. We mean that they're not affected by things. So we often think of athletes as being stoic, or military people under fire as being stoic if they don't, break and run away. People who have to deal with difficult situations, medical people who are in the ER, and they don't freak out when they see all that blood and all the other stuff that comes along with emergency situations. They have a stoic demeanor. We often think of a stoic as maybe a little bit detached, as not compassionate, as not letting themselves get involved with other people, even when they are involved with other people. Why is that the case? Well, we have a certain image of a Stoic that comes from the actual Stoics. This was a philosophy, Stoicism, that goes back in certain ways to Socrates. Plato wasn't the only person, and Aristotle wasn't the only person whose schools can trace themselves to Socrates. The Stoics trace themselves back through a bunch of different intermediaries. And then the guy who actually starts the Stoa, the Stoics, is this guy Zeno. And then there's people who study after him, and eventually we get down to this guy, Epictetus. By the time that Epictetus is studying Stoicism and advancing it, it's been around for quite a while. and he's actually a former slave. Being a slave in the Roman Empire was not, really a treat. It's not quite the same thing as what slavery was like over here in the United States or in the Caribbean, but it wasn't a good way to live. He's a slave who got freed and then started, teaching philosophy. He picked Stoicism out of the different philosophies in part because it made the most sense for his experience. He saw it as a guide for living well. So the same question about what is going to make us happy is being addressed by Epictetus, but he has very different answers than does Plato or Aristotle. And it really comes down to this issue of freedom and figuring out what's in our control. So let's look at what he says, and then we'll look at some of your examples and we'll think about this. He says some things are in our control and others aren't. Things that are in our control are opinion, how we see things, the judgments that we have about things. So you can think this is a great lecture or a boring lecture. That's within your control, isn't it? We often don't think of it that way. That, well, it just is the way it is, and I perceive it that way. But we actually have control over our opinions. Pursuit, whether we go and do things or not, we have control over that, right? Remember we talked about this with Aristotle and the voluntary and the involuntary. If you see somebody who's very attractive for you, I don't know, pick whatever. Who do we find attractive usually? Like movie stars and musicians.
Brian
What's that? Yourself? Brian Ross? Are you trying to plant a suggestion? Or?
Pretty much, yeah. That's what I'm going for.
Okay. I'm all for entrepreneurship, I suppose you could call that sort of romantic entrepreneurship. Okay, so think about people that we find attractive. Do we have to get involved with them? Do you have a choice about that sort of thing? Or we sometimes say, I couldn't help myself. Is that really true? Even if somebody we talked about this, if somebody holds a gun to your head, do you have a choice? Yeah, you have a choice to say, I'm not going to do what you say anyway. So pursuit, desire, and aversion. This is where it gets really interesting. Let's think first, what does he mean by aversion? Because we all know what we mean by desire. If you're averse to something, it's sort of like the opposite of desire. So, how many of you have headaches once in a while? Do you like headaches? Anybody wants a headache? When you have a headache, you'd probably do just about anything you can to get rid of it, right? How do we usually do it? Take some pills. Maybe you like aspirin or acetaminophen or ibuprofen. I don't know what else. I suppose you could take like morphine or things like that, but that's probably getting yourself in more trouble than a headache is worth. But, or you could drink, alcohol will dull a headache for a while. Although afterwards, what happens? You get another headache, right? You're averse to headaches. What else are you averse to? What do you try to stay away from? Anybody here who likes other kinds of pain? Some people like pain, right? Masochists. I'm not going to ask if anybody's a masochist. But most people avoid pain. What else do we avoid? What else are you guys averse to? Anybody like being embarrassed? No? Nobody wants to be embarrassed in public? No, we're averse to that. We don't like that. That doesn't just hurt our feelings, that sort of bruises them, doesn't it? You don't like having your feelings hurt either. You don't like people getting in your way when you're trying to do something. You don't like when you're already frustrated people talking to you or telling you about stuff that you're not interested in. You don't like getting on the train and having somebody who you don't like wanting to start a conversation with you, right? Or do you? Do you like that? Anybody here into that sort of thing? Some people are, but they're not the norm. So we have aversions to things, and we also have desires. And we've talked a lot about desire this semester, so I don't have to rehearse what you have desires for. You've probably thought quite a bit at this point about what your desires actually are. And you've probably started to rank order your desires. Which of your desires are actually more important. Epictetus is saying you have control over those. You have control whether you desire something or not, and how much you desire it. So think about the things you desire. If Epictetus is right, you don't have immediate control, but you have some degree of control over those. So he says, what's not in our control? Body. Everything having to do with your body, it's in your control to some extent, right? Let's think about the things that make up our bodies. Look around the room, and what do you notice about people? Your fellow classmates. What are distinctive features about them?
The clothes that they're wearing.
Okay. And every one of you chose the clothes you put on, right? Nobody dressed you this morning? Because you're not 3 anymore. You could not wear clothes, I suppose, right? You'd probably get yourself in a lot of trouble here at Marist if you did that. And it'd be a foolish thing to do anyway, because it's raining and cold outside, and you know, it wouldn't be good for your body. You have some degree of control, right? Do you have a lot of control over your clothes? How many of you have been frustrated when something that you bought a couple of months later ripped, or a year later was out of style, or you didn't know it was out of style and then somebody told you it was out of style? Do you have control over that? Not really. What's deeper than our clothes? So that's good. We looked at the surface. What else can you say about each other?
Like some of us are short and others are tall.
That's a good one. Do you have any control over that? I mean, you could wear platform shoes if you wanted. You can make yourself taller with things like that. I guess you could learn to, have a really good posture and add a couple of inches if you kind of slouch a bit. And if you're really tall, a lot of tall people actually do slouch in part because they want to hear what other people are saying, and that's how we get bad posture. But can you really control that? I mean, I suppose if you're tall, you could have at one point maybe have taken something to slow your growth. Like they say, smoking cigarettes or drinking coffee when you're a kid's supposed to stunt your growth. I don't know if that's true or not, but I suppose you could have done that. Can you take anything to make yourself taller? Human growth hormone, I guess. You could, keep feeding that to your kid if you want them to be a monster. Some parents have done that. Bad idea. It screws up their bones and their system. So yeah, height. What else?
Hair color.
That you can change, right? To some degree.
Kinda.
Yeah, I mean, you can change it, and then your roots will show in about 2 weeks. And if you do the procedure wrong, you can burn your hair off, or change it to some weird color that you really didn't want. I've seen that happen to people. What else? So these are good examples. Height, hair color. What else is on your driver's license?
Eye color.
You can change that, right? Get different color contacts.
Skin color.
Skin color, you can change that to some degree.
Your weight.
Yeah, you have some control over that, I suppose.
Your address.
Yeah, you have some control over that as well, right? What else? There's something even more and more basic than all this that you're going to carry with you.
Your name? Oh, I was going to say that.
Okay, I wasn't thinking of that, but that's a good one. You can actually change your name legally, and you can change it to crazy stuff like asterisk, space bar. You can call yourself Tron if you want to. People have done that. You can change your name to a number. What else is on your driver's license?
Whether you wear glasses or not.
That's true. I mean, you do have some control over whether you wear glasses or contacts, or if you don't mind not seeing stuff, you can just go without your glasses,
That
right?
was a trick question. I'm cheating.
You know, it's your birthday.
What's that?
Your birthday.
Your birthday, you can't control that. That's done, right? You were born on that day, you can't go back. If you had a time machine, I suppose you could maybe induce labor earlier, but there'd be all sorts of paradoxes with that. What about your sex? Your gender? You can change that to a certain extent, right? I mean, we now have these gender reassignment surgeries, you can take hormones and all that. So maybe Epictetus is wrong. Maybe all these things actually are in our control. Well, they are and they aren't. I mean, you can change your address, you can change where you're living, but is your scope, you can go anywhere you want to? Can you, I mean, you could put anything down as your address if you don't mind your mail not getting to you. Somebody else getting your mail and throwing it out. But can you actually live anywhere you want to? No, not unless you're super rich and you can buy anybody you want. You can change a lot of things in minor ways, but you can't really manipulate that much about your body. What about your body can't you change? Can you turn back time? I'm 41 years old. I can't go back to having a body like you guys do, with organs that are younger and working better, and bones that aren't, developing, over time weaknesses in them, nails that actually break quicker. That's kind of a weird thing I noticed, but not much you can do about that sort of thing, because you can't change the fact that you're aging. Can you change any of your vulnerabilities? Can you turn, think about science fiction stuff. We got those X-Men, like one of them can turn into steel. That's kind of a handy thing to have, right? I mean, if you wanted to go do dangerous things, wouldn't it be nice to have steel skin? But you can't do that in real life, can you? That's out of your control. As a matter of fact, your body is very vulnerable. Think about it. The human body is, compared to other animal bodies, we feel pain so much easier. Cats and rats can fall, a few stories and get up and they're not affected at all. What happens when you fall a few stories? You might die or break your leg or crack your ribs. Sometimes you die, yeah. There's so many different ways that the human body can be affected by things. There's so many things that can go wrong with it. You don't have much control over that. What else? Property. You have control over your property, don't you? Or do you? If somebody really wants to steal your stuff, can you stop them?
Yes.
Maybe. I mean, you could stop the first person, maybe kill them, or, set an example, right? But if anybody's really determined to take your stuff, probably they can get to it. Security companies tell you it's not actually about making anything perfectly secure. It's just about setting up obstacles to make them, spend their time on somebody else rather than on you, making yourself less of a mark. Can you suddenly become rich overnight? If you won the lottery. But that's not totally in your control, is it? Winning the lottery? If it was, I'd be rich. I just will it to be. What about your property? The things that you have. A lot of you have these laptops. How many of you have had problems with your laptops in one form or another? Actually, I should raise my hand. Sometimes it slows down for some unexplained reason, or it gets locked up, or things like that. That's out of your control, isn't it? That's very frustrating, isn't it? Because you expect the technology to work the first time and to keep on working. That's why we have technology. Reputation. Do you control your own reputation? Do you control how people see you? What do you think? Some of you are saying yes. What do you control about your reputation?
How you act.
Yeah. So if you don't want people to think you're, a complete jerk, you can avoid acting like a complete jerk. Does that mean, though, that nobody is going to say any bad stuff about you?
They can think whatever they want to think.
Yeah. Well, you're saying stuff that Epictetus would say. But before we get to that point, let's think about whether we have control over that. This is a really interesting issue to think about because you guys are exposed in so many more ways than students were in my time. I mean, when I was on campus, some people would have a reputation for being a drunk or being a good student or what else? Being sexually available, being criminals. What else do people have reputations for? Being very boring, being fun to have at a party. But that was all confined to who you actually knew. I think, some people had a reputation around town because it was a small town out in the middle of nowhere, and so I'd heard of some people before I actually met them. They had a reputation. And they may have had some role in acquiring the reputation, but for the most part, other people give you your reputation, right? How are you guys more exposed? You guys are online. How many of you are on Facebook? Only a few of you? Come on. Almost all of you are on Facebook, right? I am too. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook profile. Are any of you on other things like LinkedIn or Twitter or other social networks that you use? That's your persona. That's who you are. Only now it's not just in the physical space, and now it stays forever, right? I mean, Facebook owns everything that you put up there, and they can access it at any time. There are a lot of students who get themselves in trouble because none of you, I hope, are in this case. They post a lot of things on Facebook that maybe aren't great for public consumption, and they figure that only their friends can see it. And then, there are ways to get a hold of people's Facebook information. And employers routinely look through Facebook profiles, see if this person is a big partier, if they're, putting racist literature up, if they're doing this or that. That's part of your reputation. And you have some control over that, but not, ultimately you don't actually have control over it. What else? Command, power. Do you have control over whether you have power over other people? Yes and no, right? I mean, if you want to have power over other people, you can do it pretty cheaply for a little while. One of you actually had a great example about this on the test. The easiest way to get power over people temporarily, go to a restaurant, right? Because anybody who wants to be a jerk and lord it over somebody can do it over their server, right? If you have a power trip and you need to feel like you're in control for an hour or two, go to a fancy restaurant and start ordering people around. And they have to do what you want within certain limits because they want to keep their jobs and because they want to get a tip from you. And there's lots of people who act like real jerks. And there's very few people who go to restaurants just deliberately to do that, but they often find themselves doing that. But aside from those sort of things, do you have much control over you getting political office or being put in charge of the committee for this club or stuff like that? What do you have to do if you want that sort of thing? If you want to get power, what do you have to do? You can be crass about it if you want. We often say things like kiss a lot of behind.
To be convincing.
Yeah, you got to be convincing, and that means that you got to find out what this person likes and what this person likes, and sometimes it means lying, right? Making stuff up. Attack your opponent, even though they're not a bad person. Maybe they didn't do something. And even then, you might not win, right? And if you get power, does that mean that everybody's going to do what you say? Power is often very disappointing. You get the fancy office, and you get the people under you, and then you tell them what to do, and they don't do it. So Epictetus is onto something. What's the big difference between these things? Well, we're going to get to that. And he gives you some examples. He says, for example, if you wish your children and your wife and your friends to live forever, you're stupid. Why? Because you want to be in control of things that aren't in your control. You wish for things that belong to others to be your own. If you want people to value you and to treat you the way that you think you ought to be treated, that's not up to you, is it? It's up to them. And if you place your happiness there, you've put your happiness in somebody else's hands, haven't you? And that's a dangerous thing to do. Let's think now about some of these things. So let's start with the happy stuff, right? What are some of the things that made you guys happy recently? Something that has pleased you a lot. Any? Yeah.
Midterm grades.
Your midterm grade, okay. Good example. Yeah.
Seeing my family over the weekend?
Another good example, seeing your family over the weekend. Yeah.
I took a 4-hour nap today.
I actually enjoy taking. Yeah. We have 2 dogs and 2 cats, and this is like the time of year where you want to just curl up and sleep. And I wish I could, but I have too much work to do. Maybe you do too, but you found the time to do it. Okay, so those are 3 good examples. Now let's think about how vulnerable those goods are. Taking a nap, what could interfere with that?
People around you.
What's that?
People around you like making noise.
Yeah, if you're stuck in the dorms, I don't know if your dorms are like what dorms were when I was a college student, but they're not easy places to take naps, are they? They're not even easy places to sleep sometimes at 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Or are your dorms better? I don't know. No? What were you going to say?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say like people texting me.
Yeah, they can wake you up, or they call you, or they knock on your door. And it's kind of nice to have friends, but sometimes friends can interfere with the other things that you want. These are just minor ways in which things could be interfered with. Or you could worry about the stuff that you have to do. Right? Seeing your family, how is that vulnerable? Your family could be out of sorts. Your travel plans could be easily interrupted. We don't often realize this because our travel works so well in this country, but there's so many things that can go wrong along the way. Or you could get home from college and find out that you don't have as much in common with your family as you used to. This is a thing that often happens at Thanksgiving. People start talking politics, and they learn some things in their poli-sci class, and then they put them on the table, and their parents aren't so pleased, right? What was the other? Oh, your midterm grade. You could have done badly on your midterm. You could have a jerk professor who wants to trip you up. Do you have control over any of that? You don't even know until midterm with some of these people, do you? You could have studied the wrong material. You could have, what else could have affected your midterm grade? You could have not gotten enough sleep the night before, through no fault of your own. You could have been sick. All sorts of things could have gone wrong. Those things are vulnerable. Those are not in your control. If you're actually, Epictetus would say, if you're placing your happiness in things like that, he's not saying that you shouldn't be happy about getting a good midterm grade, or going to see your family, or even enjoying a good nap, or like I did last night, watching a funny movie with my fiance. Funny but sad movie, which Bridesmaids. And it was set in Milwaukee, which always, I like because I'm from that area. He's not saying you shouldn't take any joy in these, but he's saying that you should be very realistic about this, about how vulnerable these things are. What you should really be focusing on is what is in your control, and looking to that to make you happy, not things that are dependent on other people or factors outside of your control, not placing your desires there. So if your fundamental desire is to enjoy life with your family and to have that go on, as long as possible, you're probably going to be disappointed somewhere along the line. If your primary goal is to get super high grades, your entire college career, that may be a expectation that just can't be fulfilled. So if you choose to put your happiness there, then you will probably be unhappy. You'll probably be annoyed. You'll probably be irritated. What's a recent minor annoyance? Somebody who hasn't said anything. Who's had a recent minor annoyance?
My brother's a senior in high school and he's applying to college, so when I went home over the break, I had to listen to him argue with my parents over college applications.
Okay, that's a very down home, sort of easy to relate to kind of thing. Being stuck listening to a conversation that probably doesn't need to take place and doesn't have to take place that way. Did you intervene in it at all?
I went up to my room.
You probably did the good thing according to Epictetus, right? You detached yourself from the situation. What would have happened if you had intervened, do you think?
I don't know.
You think it would have made things better?
No, argument probably would have gone on longer.
Yeah. And now you would have gotten even more annoyed. Who else had something? Yeah.
Like the change of food,
Change of food. You mean in the cafeteria?
like not like having like home cooked meals and stuff.
Oh. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. Because your cafeteria is actually pretty good compared to a lot of the ones I've eaten in. But you're right, it's not home cooked food, is it? And you're stuck with whatever they happen to make that day. And you guys have a pretty wide range, but I imagine it must get boring after a while, even with what they have, right? Okay, so that's a good example. What about some big disappointments? What have been some big disappointments in your life? Anybody had a big disappointment? Or nobody wants to talk about their big disappointments? How many of you have had a big disappointment but you'd rather not talk about it? Quite a few of you. Yeah, we'll skip that. Let's go back to thinking about this, what we actually have control over. Epictetus is doing ethics and he's also doing philosophical anthropology. Just to go into a little bit of his philosophical anthropology, you notice he keeps making reference to what he calls the ruling part or faculty of choice. He says things along those lines. That's our rational part. Remember we talked with Plato and with Aristotle both about, part of us is rational, we can think things out, we're not just stuck with whatever our reactions are. And then we have all sorts of desires and aversions and appetites. And for the Stoics also, the emotions. What are some of the emotions that you feel on a daily basis?
Happiness.
Yeah, happiness, joy, glad. Yeah.
Aren't his views kind of unrealistic though? Like that you can't confide in anything because you're probably gonna be disappointed. Like there's some things that you have to do, and it's dependent on other things. Like you can't control them, but you have to do certain things. Like you have to eat.
Yeah.
So if he's gonna say don't go to Marist because you're not gonna like the food, then that's not logical at all. Because you're gonna have to eat what they have there.
Yeah, he
You know
wouldn't
what I
say
mean?
don't go to Marist because you're not gonna like.
Well, you're gonna be disappointed in some ways. So when you
What
go
he
to
would say
college,
is what he would say is don't set yourself up to be disappointed. Go to college, and then expect the food to be like what it is.
so be negative in a way.
Well, okay, that's a good point. And as I was driving here, I was thinking about this. Is Epictetus just a pessimist about things? I can see how it would seem that way, and I'm actually very sympathetic to that view myself. I'm not a Stoic, but I know a lot of people who are at least thinking along these lines, and they don't all seem to be radically unhappy. In fact, the point of it is to free yourself to be happy. The idea is that by taking a very, what we would probably call pessimistic, they would say a very realistic assessment of things, you won't put your desires and aversions into things that you don't have control over. So if you want let's say we take going to the cafeteria, right? Any day you go to the cafeteria, you can go to the pasta bar, right? So if nothing else is good, you can go to the pasta bar. Is the pasta necessarily going to be good? No. Could be overcooked. The chef who's back there mixing your vodka sauce or your marinara, or I've seen the things you guys have. They could screw it up. They could undercook it. They could cook it just right, and they could be kind of a jerk to you when they're handing it to you and make you feel bad. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong. Epictetus would say, just be aware of that, and then you're not going to be disappointed when things actually do, in fact, as they often do, go wrong in minor ways. And by sort of short-circuiting it, you'll keep yourself from, well, let's think about how things go wrong. Something minor happens. You go back to the table with your fettuccine with marinara sauce. You get back to the table and you realize, I really wish I'd had Alfredo instead. Okay, do you let that actually get to you? Some people would. And then they'd obsess about it. And then a small thing turns into a bigger and bigger and bigger thing. Or the chef was kind of they made it, they looked at you in a way that you're not quite sure what it meant when they handed it to you. You think they don't like it, maybe. Well, do you have any control over whether people like you or not? A little bit, yeah. I mean, if you deliberately go out of your way to be a jerk, you're probably guaranteed that they won't like you. Although maybe if they're a masochist, they will like you, right? But for the most part, you don't have control over that. So if you can it's sort of like detaching yourself and keeping these things from slowly escalating into bigger and bigger issues. And that's by choosing to do things differently than how you've been doing them so far, by looking at yourself very carefully. Let's look at how he actually advises to do this. He says, let's see. Here we go. Whatever moral rules you've deliberately proposed to yourself, abide by them as if they were laws. So he's saying there's certain principles that you would put into place, and then you follow them. And each time you run into a situation that looks like that sort of thing, that it's called for, you follow that rule. You stick to that rule. And it may not make sense at first, but over time, as this part becomes more and more free, see, this part is able to determine itself. Your desires are kind of blind. Your emotions are kind of blind. They happen. And every time that you have an emotion, it's because of some reason. But the part of you that's getting emotional, the part of you that has desires and then gets disappointed when its desires aren't met, or has aversions and then gets upset when it has to suffer what it didn't want to suffer, that part needs this other part ruling over it and saying to it, hey, you don't have control over that. I understand that you feel, disappointed, upset, angry, all these sorts of things, but you don't have to feel that way. As a matter of fact, the reason why you're feeling that way is because you've made some assumptions or you've made some judgments. Like, for instance, if I get upset because the cook looked at me the wrong way, I'm assuming that I have to be treated in a certain way. Is that a realistic assumption, Epictetus would say? Is there anything in the nature of things that says that when somebody is serving me, they have to do so with a smile? If I expect that, I'm going to be disappointed a lot, aren't I? What do you think?
Yes, that makes sense,
Yeah. When I meet people for the first time, should I expect they're going to like me? No. Do any of you expect people to, like you the first time they meet you? Before they've gotten to know you? It's probably unrealistic, isn't it? But, you do feel disappointed when you meet somebody and they don't like you and they show you that they don't like you. They're kind of cold to you. Well, you have a choice in how you look at that. You could look at it as, that's just the way things are. Or you could, get upset about it. The way things are is not the way things should be. Right? The world should conform to your ideas of the world. Stoicism is about conforming yourself to the way the world is. So he says, remove aversion from things that are not in control. Transfer it to things contrary to the nature of what is in control. if you're gonna be averse to something, be averse to losing your temper. Be averse to letting things get to you. Change what you're averse to. If you're gonna desire something, instead of placing your desires in the things that up until now have made you happy, place them in getting control over yourself, in taking control over your life, in putting yourself on a path that will actually lead you to happiness, Epictetus would say. He says, work to be able to say to every harsh appearance, every time that you get in a situation where things seem like they're bad, work to be able to say to them, you are just an appearance and not absolutely the thing that you appear to be. With regard to whatever objects give you delight or are useful or are deeply loved, remember to tell yourself what general nature they are. So if, taking a nap makes you feel good, remind yourself that taking a nap is something that is easily broken and may not make you feel good every time, and you're going to be a lot less disappointed, right? When somebody breaks your siesta, although a siesta is shorter than 4 hours, right? What else does he type? He does talk about one other thing that I want to bring up: social roles and duties. How do you know what you ought to do? This is where we get to say family stuff. Yeah.
It should probably be good for you and not exactly what everybody else tells you it should be. You know what I mean?
Say that one more time.
That it should be something that's beneficial for you and not like what other people tell you should be doing. That's what I'm guessing he's going to say. Because you're going to be disappointed if you always live by what other people tell you to do.
Yeah, I think you're right in that Epictetus would say, if you're going to be a Stoic, you should be a Stoic because you see that it's the right way to live. Not just because Epictetus told you to do it, because then, you may actually find out Stoicism isn't for you. And the culture that we live in, just like every other culture, tends to value some things more highly than they ought to be valued. And to present it as if they're easier to get and easier to hold on to. Like our culture really stresses romantic love, right? Think about half of our movies have some sort of love interest in them, often central to the movie. A lot of our songs are about love. I know there's Valentine's Day and Sweetest Day. Is there a time of year for like engagements or things like that? I don't know. I don't follow that sort of stuff. But I'm sure some people know. Does romantic love make most people happy in our culture? What's the divorce rate? Yeah. I mean, in general, it's about 50%. For your generation and my generation, it's over 50%. And that's with marriages. By the time somebody actually gets married, how many relationships do you think they've been in that didn't work out? Probably quite a few, right? I mean, are most people waiting to get married and only dating the person that they're going to marry in our culture? There's a few, but not most. And actually, the odds are better for those who do wait, apparently, of not getting divorced. I'm not sure why that is, but there's all sorts of explanations. So maybe listening to our culture about romantic love is setting yourself up for a lot of annoyance and heartache and grief and disappointment. I mean, you could actually meet the person who's the one for you. You won't actually meet them if you're not out there looking for somebody. But if that's where you're going to place all of your happiness eggs into that one basket, it's kind of a chancy gamble, isn't it? Do you have control over whether the other person loves you? Fulfills you? You could drive them away, that's within your control. Can you make a person love you? Hope none of you think you can, because if you do, you're probably in line for a lot of disappointment. So So you want to stick to what you actually can do. Going back to the social roles and duties thing, all of you have certain social roles based on what? Your family? What else is going to give you certain roles? You have one right now, you're all students. You have a choice whether to be a good student or a bad student, right? You're all training, I think, to go somewhere after this. What are you planning on doing after college? Hanging out at the coffee shop? I don't think so, right? What are you planning on doing?
Getting a job at something you're good at.
Yeah, some sort of career, and that comes with all sorts of expectations and roles. So some of you are planning on being pre-med. You know, if you become a doctor, the expectations of you are very different than a train conductor or a projectionist in a movie theater. I suspect the doctor has a bit more weight on their shoulders, you know, to get things exactly right. If a movie reel doesn't go right, that's not that big of a deal. If somebody's operation is botched, that is a big deal, isn't it? So all of you have these roles. Epictetus says you should fulfill your roles. You have certain duties because of them. So how many of you have brothers and sisters in here? Okay, so you can relate to his example. Actually, he uses a father, but in another place he talks about a brother. Is a brother unjust? So how many of you have brothers and sisters? Most of you? How many of you have ever thought your brother or sister was mean to you? Or was in the wrong and you were in the right? Okay, so this is exactly what he's talking about. You're in that situation. Do you have control over whether they're a good person or not? Whether they do the right thing? You may have tried to make them do it, right? To coerce them. How well did that work? Not very well. Mothers and fathers. You could have a good mother or a bad mother. You could have a good father or a bad father. That doesn't affect you insofar as you have your role. It's up to you to choose whether you want to be a good son or daughter, to be a good brother or sister. And you can do that even if they're a bad mother or father or bad brother or sister to you, like he's saying. If you expect them to be something that they're not, you're probably going to be very unhappy, because family stuff is, one of the worst things, right? That can really make us unhappy. Family relationships, romantic relationships, those hit us much more than work relationships or, say, student-professor relationships. If I don't like you, that's very different than your mom or dad not liking you, isn't it? One is much worse than the other. Now, like he says, are you naturally entitled to a good father? No, you're only entitled to have a father. The way the world works, you have parents. The world doesn't make them be good or bad parents. That's up to them, and you don't have any control over that. So if you place your happiness in them being good to you, you're going to be unfree. You've made yourself sort of, like he says, their slave, because you've harnessed your desires, and you chose to do that on some level, he says. You have a choice to do otherwise. You chose to make your desires tie in with somebody else's behavior. That's making you unfree. If you want to be free, you have to choose to change the way your desires work. You have to choose to change the way you think about the situation. So now here's where we get to the part with the props. How many of you have heard stuff like this before? Along these sort of lines. You have a choice in how you feel about things. This is part of our culture, or at least a certain part of our culture. In psychotherapy, this is why I've got this prop along, right? There's a particular kind of psychotherapy called cognitive behavior therapy. It's actually one of the more effective ones. It had its start in Epictetus. The reason I've got this one is the only one I had handy on the shelf. My uncle gave it to me. It's called Feeling Good by David Burns. This is the guy who popularized cognitive behavior therapy. This is a bestseller. And what he tells you in there is if you're feeling bad, if you're not feeling good, you have control over that. You have some degree of control over your emotions. You can't control absolutely how you feel, but you can change the way that you look at things and no longer feel, say, angry or depressed or anxious or fearful in this kind of situation or that kind of situation. Because you can cut off all these assumptions as they're taking place. Can you do that all at once? Can you snap your fingers and say, I'm no longer going to have an anger problem? Can you do that with being sad? Can you do that with not getting along with people? But you can change it over time, right? Bit by bit. And that is within your faculty of choice. You can't radically remake who you are with just one choice. But by choosing over and over and over again in a certain pattern, you can remake who you are, and you can remake how you feel, and you can change your basic approaches to things so that you will be more free and happier. So that's one area, psychotherapy, where, and probably some self-help stuff, where Stoicism has seeped into our culture. I brought another book along too, and this is Tom Wolfe's A Man in Full. Probably none of you have read this, right? It's a good book to read. This was a bestseller years and years ago, and the reason I got it is because it has to do with Stoicism, and it also has to do with something else that I'm interested in, prisons and guys in prison and what they do. And I'll tell you, when I taught in Indiana State Prison, and I taught this material, who do you think these guys resonated with the most? Do you think it was Plato or Aristotle? It was Epictetus. Why do you think that was?
Because they realize there's disappointment in everything. They're pretty negative, I guess you could say.
Well, it's not just that they're pretty negative. Prison is a
And
terrible place to be.
Life is treated in that way, so they're so used to being disappointed by things.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. A lot of people wind up in prison because they make a few, bad choices, sometimes just once in a while, sometimes consistently, and they often do that in response to their life not being the way they want it to be, right? The prison environment itself is not a fun one to live in. It can range from just mildly annoying to horrific, depending on what prison you're in and what the other people in it are like, and not just the guards. They're usually the least of your problems. If you're a prisoner, who do you really have to worry about?
Other prisoners?
The other guys that you're in with, because they didn't do nice things to get in there, and they didn't, pass some sort of aptitude test to get in there. They did something usually pretty bad, and that's just the one they got caught for. They may have done all sorts of other things. They may be the kind of person who preys on other people. The living conditions are often very unsanitary. The health care is often substandard. The food is not very good usually. If you want to have your own food, you have to buy it at about 3 times market price. And if you work a job in prison, you probably make anywhere from 10 to 35 cents an hour. And you have to live in a tiny cell next to a whole bunch of other people who often act like prime jerks. The guards can come in at any time and search your cell, order you to strip, search you. So it's not a nice place to live. Why would Stoicism be attractive in an environment like that? Because Stoicism is about how to have freedom in a world where you're radically unfree. How to exercise that little bit of freedom that you've got to widen it a little bit each time that you choose. To change the way that you think about things, to change the way that you desire, so that you can get by, so that you can make it. Another famous connection to Epictetus and to Stoicism, you guys probably haven't heard of Admiral Stockdale because he was famous about, that's about 20 years ago? Yeah, it's about 20 years ago. He was Ross Perot's running mate when Ross Perot ran for president. Admiral Stockdale did not do well politically. As a matter of fact, he got in a debate with, I think it was Dan Quayle and Al Gore, and they just mopped the floor with the guy. But he was a war hero, and he had been in a prisoner of war camp in Vietnam for 5 years. And those sort of places make our prisons look like a walk in the park. The sort of inhumane treatment that he was experiencing just every single day would have driven most people insane. And many people actually did go insane or just died in these camps. What got him through was the fact that in West Point, he wrote about this, in West Point he had studied Epictetus, and he had memorized the Enchiridion. And why had he memorized it? He admired somebody else who had done this. A lot of military people are into Epictetus and Stoicism. And thinking through these things allowed him to keep his sanity and to keep from being very negatively affected by the horrific treatment that he was encountering every single day. So what I'd like you to think about, this is what I'd like to leave you with. And then I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the next reading that we're going into, because it's a bit different. What I'd like to leave you with is, Mr. Davis brought up a really good point. Maybe this is unrealistic. Or maybe this is a philosophy that is only really applicable when you're in bad situations. Maybe Epictetus makes more sense the worse your life is. So think about that.